All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 8th, 1915, at Clune's Auditorium in Los Angeles, the premiere of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation, of course, one of the most famous films in American history from a filmmaking standpoint, considered a masterpiece using techniques and shots for the first time that would help advance filmmaking in this country. From an editorial and creative and historical standpoint, a fiasco, an embarrassment. Birth of a Nation famously rewrote the story of the post-Civil War South that contains all sorts of inaccuracies and embellishments about the war-torn South suffering from the effects of Northern aggression and the Ku Klux Klan as saviors of white pride and Southern society. So let's talk about this moment, this premiere of Birth of a Nation, and in particular, you know, it is such a famous movie. Maybe we can get into some of the lesser-known details about the film and the reaction and some of the myths and realities around Birth of a Nation. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Tyler Parry, Assistant Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Nevada.
Uh-oh.
Nevada.
Big controversy breaking out already.
As one born and raised in Nevada, I can affirmatively say it was Nevada.
I've covered elections in that state so many times, and I still screw it up. But Tyler writes about pop culture, the Reconstruction era, lots more stuff that intersects with the story. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
So yeah, as I said, I wonder if we can go through some of the maybe like myths and realities or complications around the Birth of a Nation story. One is, I think there's this notion out there of Birth of a Nation is a film that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, and it's basically a Klan propaganda film. Tyler, is that roughly right when you go back and actually watch Birth of a Nation?
Well, the general perception now, I think, is highly focused on the Klan. I mean, it does lead to the rebirth of the Klan in 1915 in Georgia. And so it's understandable that I think a person or people might pigeonhole the film into that specific moment in the film. But the Klan only rides through toward the end. And that seems to be the most memorable feature for many people today who otherwise haven't sat down and watched the entire 3+ hours of the film. But I would say that it also contributes to great disinformation about the Civil War, the reasons why it was fought, as well as the very problematic depiction it has of the Reconstruction period. And I think that it is just as culpable for introducing a narrative largely via the Dunning School, where Reconstruction is viewed as an abject failure, and it is depicted as people of African descent enacting revenge against the white South. And so throughout the film, the other thing that viewers are introduced to are stereotypes of Black people as inept and incapable of self-governance. And so I think that is also an important feature to consider when talking about what Birth of a Nation contributes to popular cultural depictions of the United States in the Civil War era.
Tyler and I should say, have worked together before, and we talk about film all of the time, especially when it came to Roots and things like that, Alex Haley's Roots. But Birth of a Nation is interesting because for me, it's not just that the Klan is so problematic or so heroic in this film. It's also that you get the myth of the loyal slave, the enslaved people who are happy to be there. Mm-hmm. You get the really dangerous myth of Black men as hypersexual and rapists and, wanting to attack white women or marry white women. In the film, there's a little clip that says, and now we're going to change the laws so that Black men can marry white women. And it's like so appalling to people that these miscegenation laws would be repealed. It has a lot of things in it that make the tropes that we see today. It sort of gives them their origin stories for a lot of the stereotypes that still persist throughout film.
And I suppose we haven't talked about the plot of the film. Is it worth laying that out? Or, it's basically what? It's post-assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It sort of tells the story of that. And there's two families, right? A pro-Union family and a pro-Confederacy family. And it sort of switches back and forth to show and play out kind of how this moment affects that. Is there any other sort of plot points worth? I think we get the themes. Any plot points worth highlighting?
For me, one thing that is effectively what the movie is about. It follows these two family stories. It shows battlefields of the Civil War during the Union and Confederate engagements. And I think for a person who maybe had only read about the Civil War or some pictures, this would have been very vivid for them. If you're thinking about how there were still veterans alive during that era that remembered the Civil War engagements. But one of the things that stands out about the film as far as a plot point is that Griffith and Thomas Dixon, who writes The Klansman that the movie is based upon, were very clear that the only thing that separated white Union officers from white Confederate officers was region. There's this idea within the film that I think is explicitly stated at one point that they are united by this access to whiteness that they both have. And so you ultimately see this national unification of the white body politic, and they're able to embrace the Klan, this organization of vigilante violence, on equal terms with one another. So it's no longer just a Southern issue, but embraced by white Northerners and white Southerners as well.
And just to underscore one of the points that Tyler was making, it's 1915, and so people don't have a lot of experience watching film. This might be the first film that a lot of people have seen, and to be able to see what seems like a historical moment, a historical set of stories be reenacted, it gives it a feeling of reality that I don't think we can fully appreciate as people who are very much embedded in a film and television society. For people who are seeing this for the first time, it is a searing portrayal, in part just because of the medium itself and its novelty in the American cultural landscape. Yeah.
And it's riveting because of the techniques that Griffith uses as well. So I think, and I'm forgetting the name of the technique, but it's where you show one particular scene and then you cut to another scene and then you cut back to another scene to show this, to generate suspense and momentum. So if you see a clip of the young white woman who is running away from her would-be, rapist, and then you see the Klan riding on horseback, and you cut back and forth, you create this notion of that the Klan are on their way, they're trying to get to her, and so it's suspenseful, and then you've got the music going, and people were having real heart palpitations seeing this scene play out, not knowing whether or not she would be saved, and how this would, come together. And so that's what makes Griffith, I think, so ahead of his time, the way that he's using film as a tool to generate these feelings.
Yeah, the editing, the close-ups, the fade-outs, the first film to use an orchestral score in this way, but also to your point about the sort of historical record that's being presented here, also a real, from all accounts, a real historical accuracy or attention to detail in terms of the sets and the costuming and the battlefield scenes. So it's almost like this film that gets the small things right and then the big things really wrong. But, in terms of then feeling like, oh, this is a historical record, right? It still happens with modern movies today when they have that sort of details down, it gives it that air.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because I think this is the danger of audiovisual propaganda. This is a very early example as to how palpable it can be, because if you are a person that is sitting in watching this film and you see this vivid display of a Confederate battle against the Union, then you're saying, well, that looks accurate to me. And so you're going to assume that the director or writer has done their own research and that whatever they tell you afterward is going to be accurate too. And that will be your main vantage point for understanding the circumstances of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and everything that happens afterwards. And so Griffith, and he would talk about his innovations, his pioneering work as kind of a advertisement for his services later on after Birth of a Nation is released. I mean, he has ads, in papers talking about what he had done and why he should be hired for future filmmaking. And so he knew, in order to grip the audience's attention, that he would have to use these innovative pioneering methods of displaying the work. And the consequence of that, or at least the repercussion, is that many white people who saw the film just assumed that everything in it was true.
To add to that authenticity, he has President Wilson, in the film. President Wilson saying this film is like writing history with lightning. He has it screened at the White House. He has it screened before members of Congress. He has it screened before members of the Supreme Court. So that pending any, litigation that tries to pop up its head, he knows it can be slapped down because SCOTUS saw this and SCOTUS loved it. There's a real political way that he is also safeguarding himself by getting buy-in from elected officials who will vouch for this film and thereby protect this film as well.
Yeah. So you hinted at it there, and I think that sets up our next kind of let's do myth versus reality kind of thing. But the controversy about this film, I think maybe there's a loose version of, well, this film came out, it was wildly popular in the way that we're discussing, and then, people started to reconsider it in the decades later, and now, of course, we see it as this wildly racist and damaging film. Is that the case, or was there controversy at the actual time of release?
So to start out, there was significant controversy. It would eventually be seen by millions, that is true. But I think when we delve into these discussions, we assume that its popularity meant there was no resistance to it and that there was no assertive and active resistance. And it's also important to note that its premiere was in Los Angeles, right? It was not in Mississippi. It was not in Gainesville, Florida. It was in Los Angeles, California, which meant that there was an audience to see what is effectively a racist display and caricature of Black people in film. Now, knowing this, the NAACP, which at this point was only about 6 years old, had mounted a very effective campaign challenging it and making it go to court to actually have it displayed at a theater in Los Angeles. Now, they would be defeated in that particular instance, but NAACP activism and grassroots activism did effectively ban the movie in many theaters throughout the North, in northern cities. So African Americans mounted a campaign against it. And I think this is actually a product of other forms of activism, because Birth of a Nation was predicated upon a Dunning School idea of Reconstruction, which viewed it as an abject failure and a blot on American history. But that's only because we have not considered that African Americans were reacting against this content in real time. So people like W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson were writing against this narrative as to how Reconstruction was being displayed. It's just that because we viewed popularity as our main frame of reference for understanding whether or not this film has been accepted by the American public, we've just assumed that popularity means that it was unchallenged. But we know from the historical record it was challenged very vigorously, and people took to the streets protesting it as well.
And it sounds like they were pretty effective, at least in some places, including convincing the city council in Los Angeles that they should vote to ban this movie. And it really cuts against, if we're doing some myth busting, Jody, it cuts against our vision of how censors were acting in the early 20th century. We think of them as like censoring obscene material, information about birth control, political tracts by socialists and communists. But the idea that they were censoring racist films is actually an important story that I think gets overlooked, not just in the history of this film, but in our understanding of censorship at the time.
Yeah, there had to be a court intervention, a court injunction to let this premiere that we're talking about and that we're hooked to here to go forward. And I'm assuming the Los Angeles City Council in 1915 is white, right?
Yes.
And so I mean, it shows you how much this pressure campaign actually broke through in certain circles. Yeah.
It also shows you like how there's an incident in which Birth of a Nation is screened, and afterwards a white man leaves the theater and shoots a black teenager.
Right.
And that moment is also so indicative of the danger that the NAACP was trying to warn against, because they were saying this is not just popcorn and entertainment. This can harm people. This has real damaging effects. And who knows what kind of galvanizing, violence it can do, particularly in 1915 when you're thinking mob violence, racial mob violence is at an all-time high. Red Summers coming about 4 years later. You still have, World War I tension taking place as well. So people are racially on edge, and they don't need much to sort of spark that flame.
Yeah, I want to stick with that for just a second, because that's an important caveat to all of these anti-racist censors out there, that a lot of these city governments were banning the film or wanted to censor the film because they didn't want the unrest that accompanied it, right? It was about public order, not necessarily, black people are being treated unfairly in this film, we have to stop people from seeing it.
If my memory serves me correctly, Griffith would release another version of this with like an addendum at the end or something to say where it's basically against censorship. So he makes this kind of free speech depiction within the film to where he's effectively saying he will not be censored by anybody.
Well, do you know what the title of his next film is?
Yes.
It's called Intolerance.
That's right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it's his reaction to what he saw as the suppression of his speech in the reaction, which, I mean, talk about stuff that we see playing out today. It's like, I say something objectionable, you call me out on it, and then I say that you're being intolerant and you're suppressing my speech.
You're trying to cancel me.
Literally, yeah, who knew? But yeah, his film today would have been called Uncanceled. Someone already.
Who knew that the intellectual dark web had a 100-year-old history?
Exactly. Intolerance. Look, D.W. Griffith, pioneering filmmaker. Intolerance, also 3.5 hours long, and apparently, yes, a bit of a slog.
Can I also say, though, that Oscar Micheaux, a famous African-American filmmaker, also makes a film in response to Birth of a Nation called Within Our Gates, that there are it's not just the NAACP as a political organization trying to respond to or confront this. Other filmmakers, Micheaux in particular, are speaking up and saying like, hey, listen, this is not the only kind of thing we can consume. One other thing that's kind of unheard of or remarkable about this film is that the cost of a ticket was $2.20. That sounds super high for 1915. The equivalency is about $51.50.
So all of you complaining that that the latest Avengers or Spider-Man is $14.99 or $17, it costs you $50 to see Birth of a Nation.
Oh, there's no way I would go.
Well,
there's no way.
I think that's safe
for a lot of reasons.
Yes.
I don't even want to pay that to stream monthly.
That's right.
Yeah, but I mean, wildly popular, and turned Griffith into someone who could just. One of my favorite movie podcasts is called Blank Check, and it's about directors who get this sort of blank check to do whatever they want for the rest of their careers. That's what this happened with Griffith for sure. Okay, let's see. Let's look back to the Ku Klux Klan. Let's paint that picture a little bit more. Is it really a one-to-one that now there's a depiction, as we said, just in the final scene, the Ku Klux Klan comes in, but obviously saves the day. Is it the case that really Birth of a Nation airs, millions of people see it, and now Klan chapters pop up all around the country. And there's got to be other forces going on as well, right?
Well, yeah.
I think that the Klan would have been rebirthed if the movie hadn't come out.
Okay.
Facts.
But with that said, I think that the depiction of Klan heroism galvanized the Reformation. It provided the right socio-cultural moment for William Joseph Simmons to believe that not only could it be re-energized, but could spread throughout the country. Because again, I mean, Griffith's work was not just popular in the South. This is something that penetrated white audiences all throughout the United States. So you start to see the growth of the Klan in its, second generation, as it's usually called, largely produced and reproduced by the favorable depiction it received in one of the most popular films of its time. So yes, it could have been re-energized, but I think that Griffith's film pushed it over the edge to the point where it probably grew much bigger than it would have if it would not have been produced that way.
Yeah, I think that the idea of organized violence and racist politics was going to be happening in the late 19-teens and 1920s either way. But one of the things that the film does is it provides a kind of cultural language that people like, that the new Klan taps into, right? A visual language that they understand both has a currency, given the popularity of the film, and inspires fear among Black as well as Jewish and Catholic victims of the second Klan, because even the people who opposed the film saw that same image. Because, it is true that only at the very end does the Klan appear, but the movie posters had the image of a Klansman on them that I think helped spread that image, even if you didn't see the film.
And it's not just the Klan who come at the end of the film. Jesus himself comes back to earth. Like, it's like this moment where every time I show it in my class, my students are like, what? Who's that? I'm like, that's Jesus Christ. And in all his glory. Like, it's so fantastical. But at the same time, I think that is even more of the church is also sort of sponsoring this. Yes, these are heroes. Like, these are not problematic people. And, we come later to find out that these Klansmen are ministers and officers and sheriffs and judges and teachers and coaches. And, there's not really a space in which they're not operating. And there's also not a region in which they're not operating. I think of what's that? Kenneth Jackson's Ku Klux Klan in the city. Like, they're in cities, they're in major metropolitan areas, and they're all across the country. And they really gain their climax in the 1920s. I mean, they have, I think, about 4 million members in 1926.
And it's worth pointing out that their largest political hold is in states like Indiana and another controversially pronounced state, Oregon. Oregon.
We'll get letters.
Don't write us.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, I kind of want to circle around to Griffith as a filmmaker, and this is a seminal piece of work. I mean, I saw this when I was in film classes in college, and it's always on the list of 100 best films, and all these innovations and so forth. I mean, how do you hold this in your head?
So this may be a cop-out answer, but I will say that I would quote, or at least paraphrase, Spike Lee's thoughts on the film. He gave an interview once, pretty recently actually, that he was asked about, showing Birth of a Nation, because it's controversial now as far as, do you introduce young people to this film because of what it displays? And his thoughts were essentially that, yes, you screen the film. You need to be able to introduce these types of displays to individuals. You could talk about the innovations that it held, but it has to be placed within context. If the conversation does not include critique and criticism of the racist portrayals of Black people and the problematic, to say the least, envisioning of the Reconstruction period and this idea of the heroism of the Ku Klux Klan, if the conversation doesn't include that, then no, you shouldn't show it. because if it's devoid of context, that is what leads us down this troubling path. So I think many people would agree that the film does need to be shown and the innovations need to be discussed, because how else do you explain its popularity other than it did something new that the audiences hadn't seen? But then you also need to address the very problematic portrayals as well.
And there's an interesting story to be told about the side-by-side or the intertwined relationship between film advances, particularly to create an emotional response and the emotion that they were trying to generate, right? You can study Leni Riefenstahl films in order to understand all kinds of film techniques, but it has to be understood what those techniques were tied to and what they were being used to do.
Kellie, do you use this in your classes?
I do. I think you can't teach a film called Understanding American Slavery Through Film and not teach The Birth of a Nation. I mean, I teach Birth of a Nation. We watch it. They watch Gone with the Wind. We watch a lot of films, Black exploitation films, Mandingo, that are really problematic. But the other thing is that I want them to see that, like, as much as my students are probably appalled by watching something like Birth of a Nation, I have to, like, remind them, like, if we don't pay attention, you will just look at something like Spielberg's Lincoln and say, oh, this is so much better, or Glory, and say, oh my gosh, look how far we've come. And you're like, no, the same white savior tropes are still here. The same, like, black sidekick tropes are still here. The same mammy tropes are still here. They're just reincarnated versions of, like, the same idea, but cloaked under something that feels more contemporary or feels more comfortable to us. And so we're not, paying attention to the fact that, like, nope, there's Birth of a Nation, there's Birth of a Nation, there's another Birth of a Nation, like, popping up all over Hollywood. So yeah, it's so important for them to see that. And I think they're much more critical of film after they've seen it.
All right. Well, that is a great note to end it on. This has been really, really fascinating. So Tyler Parry, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Thank you so much for doing this. And tell us about those books again, and where else can people find your work?
Yeah, sure. So my first book, Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual, was released in November 2020 with University of North Carolina Press. But my most recent book was a co-edited collection that looks at the history of African Americans at the University of South Carolina. It's called Invisible No More. But one of the most recent books I'm working on that has to do with film is I'm actually going to start writing a history of a film called White Dog, which was filmed and produced in the 1980s, but was never released until in limited fashion in the 1990s because it was very controversial. It follows the story of a dog that appears to have internalized racial hatred against African Americans. And so it's a pretty complex, unique story. And so I found this through the archives, through the references of my friends, and I started realizing that there's a big story to be told about American history through this film. So
right, well,
that's one project.
When that comes out, we'll be back on.
I know,
please.
you got to come back.
Amazing.
All right, well, that's great. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia. From